So we'll just welcome everybody who's joining. So lovely to have people taking time. There are actually today quite a few competing speaker events on campus at this lunch hour, which isn't always the case, but so we're also glad that we can record this and make it available afterwards for everyone. So yeah, I think with that, maybe we can begin. And Rachel, do you want to lead in with?
Sure. Yeah. So welcome everybody to the Environmental Justice and Sustainability Speaker Series. I'm Rachel Christopherson. I work for the Center for the Blue Economy, who helps to host the series. The series is largely student driven. Our guest was invited by students, and the students have set the agenda for the speaker series. And today I'd like to read a land acknowledgement, which says that we are meeting physically in the indigenous tribal area of the Achasta, today known as the city of Monterey, California. The Ohlone, Costanoan, Esselen Nation tribal members, known as the Esselen, the Caramelino, the Monterey Band, the Rumsen, the Chalon, the Ohlone, and the Costanoan, are the indigenous peoples of Monterey County. All enrolled tribal members and their ancestors are identified through the San Carlos Borromeo de Carmelo mission and the Nuestra Senora de la Soledad mission in their original records. We acknowledge the tribal government, we respect their spiritual roles today and the cultural heritage and beliefs that are so important to both the Ohlone, Costanoan, and Esselen Nation and to all of us. So with that acknowledgement, I turn it back to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you. And welcome to everybody who's joining us today. It is my honor to introduce and introduce all of you to Jackie Patterson. So I'll just give a brief introduction. Jackie is the Senior Director of the NAACP Environmental Climate Justice Program. She has, since 2007, served as coordinator and co-founder of Women of Color United. She's worked as a researcher, program manager, coordinator, advocate, and activist on women's rights, violence against women, HIV and AIDS, racial justice, economic justice, and environmental and climate justice. Jackie served as Senior Women's Rights Policy Analyst for ActionAid, where she integrated a women's rights lens for the issues of food rights, macroeconomics, and climate change, as well as the intersection of violence against women and HIV/AIDS. She's also previously served as Assistant Vice President of the HIV/AIDS program for IMA World Health, providing management and technical assistance. Yes, and she's also served as the Outreach Project Associate for the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and Research Coordinator for Johns Hopkins University. Jackie is a former Peace Corps volunteer. She served in Jamaica and the West Indies. She's written many articles. If you go to her bio on the NAACP page, you can see a list of all of those amazing articles. And finally, Jackie holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Maryland and a master's in public health from Johns Hopkins. And she currently serves on the International Committee of the U.S. Social Forum, Steering Committee for Interfaith Moral Action on Climate, the Advisory Board for Center for Earth Ethics, as well as on the boards of directors for the Institute of the Black World, Center for Story-Based Strategy, and the U.S. Climate Action Network. That's a lot, but I wanted to name all of it and give Jackie her due, because it's an incredible list of both organizations and also topic areas. And it's part of why we wanted to bring Jackie to MIS to speak with all of us about the work that she does. So we're going to do something a little bit different today. Jackie's going to speak for as long as she likes, but probably somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes. And then we're going to transition into having a conversation that I will be in with Jackie around several different topics. And then we'll have questions from the audience. So without further ado, I turn it over to Jackie. Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Good to meet you. I'm looking forward to the more interactive part of this conversation. I just thought I would open with a few kind of framing how we see these issues around sustainability, around environmental justice, and so forth. And particularly in this time, in this moment of, you know, the combination of COVID-19 and the kind of many disasters that are affecting the nation, and this kind of manifestation of climate change, the economic crisis, and certainly the racial awakening and uprising that's going on, and all of this amidst an election year, which is going to be pivotal no matter what happens. And so there's just a lot happening at this very moment. So framing all of that out in this context and what that means for the way we need to think about the way forward is critical for us to be very contemplative about, and deliberative about, and intentional about how we engage. So when we look at this moment, it's directly tied to our history, the history of this nation, of our systems, our political and financial systems being, you know, really starting this nation as it exists now in terms of the United States of America. As we started out with our land acknowledgements, the United States of America was founded on extraction, exploitation, and domination. Like literally, like people like to kind of kid ourselves that our nation was founded on liberty, in terms of people, you know, seeking freedom from where they were in England, but it was liberty for some and oppression and enslavement for others. And so, and it really began this pattern of this inverse relationship of people being advantaged by virtue of disadvantaging and oppressing others. And so this is where we've started. The NAACP has a civil rights agenda that is civil rights for all. And the majority of our constituency is African American, and it was started around kind of racial justice issues. And we know that in this nation, who you are and where you live matters to one's relationship with each and every one of our systems, and so forth. And that's not only within the United States, but now we've kind of exported that way of being in terms of the world. And so this is where we have this with African Americans and even with nature, sharing this relationship of being extracted and exploited. And so this historic social, political, and economic disenfranchisement has been detrimental to our generational resilience. And it's also been detrimental to the systems of the earth in terms of sustainability. Our ecosystem has been inextricably, you know, in some ways we're reaching the point where it's kind of irreversibly damaged by what we're doing. As you know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change gave us a countdown. We're in about 10 years towards, if we don't make radical change, we're not going to be able to change quickly enough before the earth starts to become even less inhabitable for us as humans, although the earth will continue on because it is resilient and regenerative, but it's the ability, you know, our ability to live on it will definitely, is already definitely being impacted. So for African Americans, we know it's been 400 years since the start of the first enslaved Africans arriving after making the transatlantic journey. We know that we came to this country having been ripped away from our land and our families and what would have been our generational wealth and what would have been our kind of legacies and so forth, and brought here to become as cargo, really, in the hulls of ships, stacked like in an area of the ship that wasn't meant for human occupation. And as a result, you had folks dying on that journey, and literally bodies being tossed over into the Atlantic like we would throw away a piece of tissue. And there became kind of this dehumanization and lack of and this is where you get to a point where we're talking about Black Lives Matter, because it's to say that even to have to assert one's humanity, that one's humanity is should be valued like anyone else's humanity, is the baseline at which we're starting in this country. And so taken away from our generational wealth to become someone else's generational wealth. And there began that inverse relationship. That I was watching the Today Show, and there was this quote, I need to get the actual quote, but it was saying that, if I use my candle to light your candle, it doesn't take away from the light in my candle. And I thought that was a great, kind of analogy around the abundance of the earth. But we act like our systems and our behaviors act like that I can only be well if you're not well, in that sense, in terms of the ways we have been treated and dehumanized in order to build the wealth of certain people in this nation. So when it became institutionalized in ways that have left us in harm's way as it relates to environmental injustice. So starting with once emancipation happened, around the same time, they put these laws in place, the Morrill Law and the Homestead Act, which actually was intended to give land grants to white Americans for colleges and for those who are seeking land to farm. And they were accompanied by subsidies and so forth to facilitate the acquisition and the use of land. And so that land ownership and again, the wealth from enslaved persons becoming part of generational wealth, then resulted in, even as we were becoming liberated from slavery, we still were at a disadvantage in terms of not having access to those subsidies because we're still enslaved when that happened. And then as we came out, then we didn't have as we began to acquire land, we didn't have the legal services to be able to pass that land down from generation to generation. And all that is important because we know that today, on average, white household wealth is $171,000. On average, African-American household wealth is $17,000. So literally 10 times, as white wealth is 10 times. This is why you see books like Black Labor, White Wealth, because that is literally how this nation was established. And then when it comes to single Black women-headed households, then the average family net worth is $5. So so $5 compared to $171,000 for a white household is just an unbelievable extreme in wealth differentials. And so you see how that kind of plays out in so many aspects of society. We're least likely to be homeowners, and then home ownership is tied to so many of the advantages of society and the ways that people can step up into kind of upward mobility, so to speak, and security. So African Americans are 40% more likely to be homeless, and also African American families are more likely to be in food insecure. And so we see it as COVID-19, that becomes an issue both in terms of vulnerability to COVID-19, because the very health conditions like diabetes, hypertension, and so forth were directly tied to diet and so forth. So that history of redlining and separation from resources means that vulnerability is greater. And then on top of it all, the Harvard School of Public Health, one of the Harvard schools, found that that even the pollution, the presence of pollution, the PM2, particularly particulate matter, is tied to COVID-19, which in African American is 71% of African Americans live in counties in violation of federal air pollution standards. And an African American family making $50,000 a year is more likely to live next to a toxic facility than a white American family making $10,000 a year. And so So when we begin to see these staggering statistics around how African-American families are more likely to be impacted by COVID-19, you tie all of those factors together, the environmental, the economic, and other factors, all housing, all play a role in that vulnerability, and all play a role in the vulnerability to the impacts of climate change as well, whether it's the urban heat island effect, or it's the disasters and the poor housing stock, or it is the disasters and the fact that our houses are more likely to be sited in floodplains, or it's the fact that we have actual policies that are on the books, like the Army Corps of Engineers. When Plaquemines Parish in Louisiana was flooded after after Hurricane Matthew, which was 7 years after Hurricane Katrina, they asked them why it was that after all the levee fortification they did after Hurricane Katrina, why Plaquemines Parish wasn't, that levee wasn't fortified. And they said, well, they have a formula they use to decide to prioritize which levees would be fortified. And the formula applied points based on what the economic impact would be if that levee was overtaken. So again, this is where you see how how oppression and marginalization literally becomes a death sentence for someone because it becomes institutionalized in our very nation's policies and practices. And so you people care more, and so the system cares more about property values than it does about people. And we see how that plays out even in the ways that in COVID-19, how we had the environmental policies rolled back because it was more of a profit-driven decision-making, caring more for companies than, again, the well-being of people. So our lungs are already impacted from being more likely to be in areas with toxic facilities and so forth, and making us not only more vulnerable because of the pre-existing conditions to get COVID-19 in the first place, but then the severity of it and the impacts of it are greater because our lungs are impacted by that chronic exposure over the years. And then they take away whatever little protections there would have been, so that the pollution is just like no holds barred in terms of polluting in these communities. So again, just all these systems just compound on each other to kind of bring people down further and further. So all of these challenges, and then on top of it all, as we've watched the public, the televised murder of George Floyd, and just that one just happened to be televised, and it's just a part of the pattern of criminalization and when we talk about criminalization, it's really on a continuum, whether it's people just doing regular things and somehow being seen as criminal, and if I had shown you a PowerPoint, which I would have shown you this one image from Hurricane Katrina, where there's two white folks who are in the floodwaters, and they're carrying groceries, and the caption is from Associated Press, and it says, "Two people, wade through chest-deep floodwaters after finding bread and groceries at a grocery store." And then the same Associated Press, there's another story that was where there was an image of an African-American young man, and it says, "A young man wades through chest-deep floodwaters after looting a grocery store." And so literally the same activity, but these folks are just surviving. They're finding what they can. And this kid is a criminal looting. And so that kind of characterization is what led to what happened on the Danziger Bridge, when folks who were just going to try to find relatives or whatever were people called the police on them and said that they were looters, and they were met with this unarmed families were met with gunfire and literally killed on the Danziger Bridge just for doing what any of us would be trying to do after a disaster. And so, and all the other stories, whether it's being in Starbucks while Black, or the Airbnb while Black, or all these different things. And then looping back again to climate change, we have the situation where I was watching CNN, which I've done pretty much 24 hours a day since this whole thing started, and they were talking about the wildfires, and they said that because of the early releases from prison, that they had less people to fight the wildfires. And they said, they didn't actually say less people. They said there were fewer resources available to fight the wildfires. And so we're actually doing a paper and project on environmental justice in the prison industrial complex, because that the use of the word resources is consistent with the fact that if you look in county records, they will list tractor trailers, typewriter, or whatever, and then they'll list prisoners with a $ next to them as just a commodity to be used for labor in situations like whether it's wildfires or other types of labor. They use prisoners in the cleanup after the BP oil drilling disaster. And of course, in each of these circumstances, they don't get the level of protection or even gear or training or other types of protection. So they have higher rates of injury and even fatality in doing these types of jobs. And it's again that dehumanization and again that commoditization. And this is why that term prison industrial complex exists. And even as we address climate change, it's all still, inextricably interconnected. So I want to leave us time to discuss, but just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of that background. But as we think about solutions, it's why we can't really just tweak such a deeply flawed system that is literally predicated on there being winners and losers, and it's predicated on the losers being by gender, by race, by immigration status, by indigeneity, and these types of things. And so as a result, it's not a system that can be tweaked. That's why they talk about the defunding the police isn't about like not having community safety, but it's about overhauling a system that is based on basically enslaving and re-enslaving people or oppressing, or as opposed to actually thinking about ways that, yes, we keep community safety and wellness, but we think about ways that we have a society that doesn't drive people to do certain things that happen because they don't feel like they don't have any other choices, and systems where we actually are working towards rehabilitation as opposed to just locking people up and throwing away the keys and then further infringing upon their rights as well. So for us, that means that our systems, our reform systems need to be more than reform. They need to be revolution in some ways, starting with getting money out of politics. We know the fossil fuel industry is not only putting big money into fighting against clean air and clean water, but they're also paying into groups like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, that supports prison privatization, that supports voter suppression, that supports water privatization, and all the different things that make life harder for even these very same people that have all these compounded challenges. This is why we have to, dismantle this. I bought this book called Weapons of Math Destruction, MATH, because of these formulas like the levy formula, even formulas around where they're going to put sound barriers, like on the, if you have highway and they have sound barriers for the road, those are based on what the property values are, whether you're going to get a sound barrier or not, even for the highways. I mean, there's so many, our schooling is all based on property values. So, kids are already having all these different challenges. On top of it all, they have an under-resourced school system. And this is why we see where kids who are with asthma are having a hard time paying attention in school, kids with asthma who are having time going to school, kids who are exposed to lead and other types of toxins that have a harder time paying attention in school because it's tied to ADHD. They're not having access to healthy and nutritious foods, which affects everything from attention to even wakefulness. And then on top of it all, you have an under-resourced school, which tends to all be the same kids, unfortunately, all the same kind of neighborhoods and same circumstances. Then those kids are less likely to be on grade level by the third grade. And studies show that if you're not on grade level by the third grade, you're more likely to enter into the school to prison pipeline. So this is how all of these things, again, are inextricably interconnected. So dismantling the weapons of math destruction is definitely critical. And we also need to be thinking about how we overhaul all of our systems, like our food systems, where we have a situation where you know, in a land of abundance where literally all of our earth can be constantly regenerating food. You know, if we really were in touch with what foods can be grown at what times, we could have a system where our land is constantly generating food. But instead we have a situation where there's some communities where they're eating taquitos and Doritos and Cheetos, and that's their, you know, so much of what the foods that are heavy in sodium, heavy in sugars, heavy in preservatives, and, you know, not an antioxidant to be found, much less the various vitamins and minerals that we need to actually have healthy, sustained systems. And so we can really overhaul those systems. So we get like big ag, you know, groups like Monsanto that grow Terminator seeds that are against the very laws of nature, and so forth and so on. So we can have a distributed food system so that everyone has access to foods. We're growing foods everywhere. In the pandemic, for the first time, I'm growing a garden on my little balcony. So now I've got dill out there, cilantro, which is my favorite thing, and parsley and tomatoes and peppers, and somehow they're all kind of hanging in there with a couple of fits and starts, but they're all doing much better now. And so, but we can all do that. If I can do that on the balcony of my tiny balcony, then we all have the capacity to grow something somewhere. And so we need to look to shift our food system so we don't have a situation where whether I'm going to be able to eat something nutritious is dependent on what's in my wallet or what's in my purse. It should not be. Whether I just came from a community called Sand Branch, Texas. I went out for the first time since March and drove to Dallas from Baltimore, which was quite a journey. But because there's this community, a freedmen settlement that now that has never had running water. It's called Sand Branch, Texas. I would definitely advise you to look that up. There's a few articles about it out there. And so in a place, you know, in a land like in a world that's, you know, 2/3 water, to have a community that has no access to running water, and it's a settlement as well. They have all kinds of land theft, land lost things in their history, but these are the types of things that, you know, again, keep people down. And they're living, I mean, having lived in Jamaica, having gone to sub-Saharan Africa repeatedly over the years, those were the kind of home conditions that people were living in Sand Branch, Texas, which was literally it's a suburb basically of Dallas, and one of the wealthier cities because of the oil money, of course. And so that was just such an egregious injustice to have that situation. And so they're not only are they dependent on bottled water donations to get from day to day, but because they don't have garbage pickup service, because it's an unincorporated area, they literally run little mini incinerators in their backyards. They just burning plastic and all the other stuff that they're generating. Imagine what's going into their lungs every day. I mean, again, between the no water and the constant burning, it's just an environmental catastrophe really happening there. They've gone from a population of 500 to a population of 100, and some of that is just people dying and other people just finally being able to get out, but it's just not fair. So we need to make sure that our systems are such that we don't have water privatization, and that we have systems where everyone can have access to water, again, not dependent on what's in their pocket. We need to make sure that we have housing systems that make sure that we have fair and livable housing conditions for all. We need to make sure that we have a system of democracy where our votes actually count and where we are represented in our governance systems. And we need to have a recognition of the types of reparations that need to be made for people who were, again, taken away from their/our wealth, and to become the generational wealth of other people, and whose disadvantage was so that others could be advantaged. And so it wasn't just something that happened to us. It's like, because someone is doing well, we aren't doing well. And that needs to be acknowledged by this nation, and that needs to be, there needs to be redress for that. And then finally, just as we think about our systems going forward, we need to just remember that we are all interdependent, and that we are all, you know, swimming in this kind of the same river together, and that we need to have our systems in a way where there is that cooperation, where there is that acknowledgement of not only our interdependence as people, but our interdependence with the ecosystem, so that we have more regenerative, harmonious ways of living, so that there is sustainable life for all, like whether it be walking on two legs or swimming with fins or otherwise. So that would be my kind of framing remarks, and definitely looking forward to this conversation with you all.
Thank you so much, Jackie. That's so helpful to have that context, and yeah, from there we'll dive a little bit into some of those topics, and of course there's so many. So we'll see where the river takes us in this conversation, and we will flow with it, because ease is the word of my day. Let's try and make it easy. One thing I just want to mention to those who are listening: if you have questions, we will save some time at the end for questions. I think the most efficient way to do it is for you to drop your questions, or let us know that you have a question, drop that into the chat, and then we'll just go through down the list in the chat. And you can drop those questions in at any time. You don't need to wait until we finish. So as they come up, just let us know, and we'll circle back to that. So yeah, so I'm, you know, Middlebury has a very long-standing relationship with, whoops. Am I frozen or nope? Okay, great. There was a little pause. Middlebury has a long-standing relationship with the Peace Corps, and one of the experiences that you had that I've read about and heard about is the community. I was thinking about this when you talked about Sand Branch. So the community in Jamaica that you were working in that was so impacted by the Shell oil. I don't know if it was a refinery or a refinery. And so I just wanted to start there for a minute. It sounds like maybe that was one place where your interest in environmental justice really got sparked.
Yes, quite so. Yeah, the community was contaminated, the water supply was contaminated by Shell oil, and that was before I encountered the community. That was, yeah. And so that was definitely my first kind of known and conscious experience with environmental injustice, which was definitely there, and it was the kind of David and Goliath type of scenario where it was big Shell oil and this small impoverished community that had their water supply contaminated, and no real kind of legal avenues for justice. They raised a bit of a, you know, it became newsworthy. And so I think Shell then felt like they needed to do something. And what they did was provide funding for pit latrines for the communities, and funding for like a 3 R's program for the schools, like basically teaching kids about recycling. And so that was it for poisoning these people with the stuff from the Shell oil refinery. And so I was, you know, I came into the situation, it had already happened. So so my learning was just kind of what the egregiousness of the injustice is. It wasn't something where I was able to kind of work on it or anything, or help to organize around it. It was just like an education to see
an awakening moment.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so interesting. I'm curious if you have any opinions on the Peace Corps now. I mean, there so much has been going on with the Peace Corps. They've had to, you know, pull everybody out and repatriate, and you know, so there's like COVID related stuff. Also, Peace Corps can maybe be seen as kind of a colonial type of organization. So I don't know if that you want to talk about at all, or if the idea of decolonizing the Peace Corps is something that anyone talks about I haven't researched this, but is that a thing?
It is a thing. So when I was in Peace Corps, first off, Jamaica is, it's reggae, it's revolution song, it's all of that, So there's like a level of consciousness and revolutionary spirit there that's fairly unique. And there was a fairly pervasive thought that Peace Corps was the CIA, like that, like there were there's CIA operatives, within this, and I think that probably has been true. You wouldn't put anything past the U.S. government, that's for sure. So I think that was not an unfounded concern, but I do not think there are CIA people within my group, Group 52, but I'm sure that's part of the history. But so there was that to really, and then there was also kind of the folks who were in there and the types of placements. Like there wasn't, as you know, people they will tell you that it's a combination of wanting to help the host country, but also it's supposed to be a learning experience for the volunteer. And the extent to which that was balanced definitely varied a lot. Like we had one person who was a drama major who was then trained to be a banana extension officer, at in Jamaica there. And so like both the extent to which people had the specialized skills that were needed, and then the extent to which people were displacing people who could have had jobs, and those, and like, if you're going to train her to be a banana extension officer, why not actually train someone from Jamaica to be who doesn't have the skill? Because if it's one of the skilled
Staying
person
there for longer than 2 years and is invested in the life and community. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And like, yeah. So, and if resources are going towards training an unskilled person to be a skilled person, then those resources should be for the nation as opposed to, yeah. So, so then those kind of things were definitely happening. I gather, because I've kept in contact with Peace Corps in different ways, and yeah. So I gather that is at least evolved over the years to some extent, but it still hasn't, it's definitely not, it hasn't evolved enough. And so there is some movement to try to transform the Peace Corps, and some acknowledgement that as long as it's a US government entity, how far one could actually go in that is limited by the administration.
Sure. Yeah. Well, you kind of answered my next question, so we can probably just skip over it. But I was going to ask about how the Peace Corps could strengthen its mission as it relates to like the environmental sector placements and projects, but you've kind of addressed that already, at least in some ways. So yeah. Well, yeah. Interesting. Go ahead, please.
No. I was just going to say that, that I think that just like the Peace Corps, just like kind of the whole development paradigm as a whole, it needs to shift from being kind of a disabling, like it kind of, where it's like, the disabling profession, so to speak, or one that kind of keeps itself in business by not actually changing the systems that it's trying to interact with, but actually just kind of helping in a way that's that just kind of perpetuates dependency. So like really a huge overhaul of the entire development paradigm, with Peace Corps being a part of that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I can see the line from Peace Corps to NAACP. And there was a lot in between for you. And the one thing that I really wanted to touch on was the listening tour that you did, the grant that you got, the Women of Color Climate Justice Road Tour that you did, and that then I think led to your position at NAACP. And in particular, it's the intersection really of race, gender, and climate justice or injustice. So I just would love to hear a little bit more about that road tour and that experience. And
yeah, sure. Yeah, that so that was really going around the country speaking to women who were either working implicitly on environmental injustice or climate change, like they might have been working on food justice or water rights or something. And so they wouldn't necessarily name climate, but that's what, you know, working towards climate justice is about. Or people who were explicitly working on, people who were working on disaster equity and so forth. So that, I mean, as I wanted to deepen my work around climate change, I really wanted to understand it from people who are on the front lines, who are already doing the work. What do they think are the problems that needed to be solved? What do they think are the gaps in the movement and so forth? So that, yeah, I literally rode around the country doing those interviews with folks, everyone from the Association of Asian Pacific Islander Environmental Network, speaking with them about their work with nail salon workers, to visiting the Apopka, the Immokalee workers in Florida, and learning about farm workers, and then starting to understand the immigration issues and how farm workers are treated in terms of lack of labor rights, and again in terms of just kind of essential workers. This is one of the, I just did a talk recently about people whose work is essential, but the worker is not actually valued as if they are essential. And so, so I'm talking about kind of essential work, but disposable workers. And that was the kind of dynamic that you continue to find from slavery to now immigrant farm workers. And so,
And in COVID times too.
and definitely in COVID time. Yeah,
right?
I was the talk I did was actually in the context of COVID times, but we talked about it in a broader frame of how it's a repeating pattern in the U.S. system.
Yeah. And so that listening tour led to the more permanent position in the development of the environmental and climate justice program at the NAACP. There's so much, I don't think we can really unpack much in the time we have, but I did want to ask one question, and that was, that was kind of a new program for the NAACP, right? And so here's this organization that's kind of focused on equity and human rights, not the environment. Yes, we get it's related, but still. And what was it like to establish that program, within this organization? And connected to that, really, what advice you have for keeping environmental and climate justice front and center when it may be competing for attention with other important goals? Like, I think many of us will go into work for organizations where it may not be the only focus or the major focus. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah. So when I first joined, at the beginning, it was kind of continuing on the listening tour, like just meeting with folks, hearing what they were interested in and so forth. And at the same time, we have this, these things they call the Civil Rights Advocacy Training Institutes, where there's everybody comes together for these regional trainings. And the first one we did, the first couple that we did, the session was called Climate Justice 101. And at the end of the first one, someone said, "Oh, this was really interesting. I see how it relates to my community and so forth. Thanks." And they said, "But I have to tell you, when I saw Climate Justice 101, I thought this was going to be about the climate of injustice in the world." Like, they didn't even think it was about environment. Like, it was so far away from the NAACP's civil rights agenda that it just even, they weren't familiar with the term and they didn't think about climate change. And then the next time, similarly, someone came up and said, "Wow, this was great. I'm going to take this back to my community. But I have to tell you, when I saw Climate Justice 101, I thought this was going to be about the climate of workplace discrimination." So again, they put it in the frame of something that they actually thought would be familiar within the context of the NAACP. And so fast forward to as we started to do the work, it was really about like having conversations with people and helping to put it in really making sure that we keep that intersectionality frame. And so we start where people are and make those connections. So when I spoke to the folks in Seattle, for example, they were like, "Yeah, we certainly care about the birds and the bees or whatever, but in the trees, but what we're dealing with is criminal justice issues and with job issues, creating jobs." And I said, "Well, I've got the perfect idea. Like, what about if we do a project for formerly incarcerated persons creating jobs in the solar industry and actually training them on solar energy efficiency, retrofits, and weatherization. And they were like, yes, that would be great. And so all of what we do is about meeting people where they are and folding in the environmental and climate justice aspects to that. And so those are places where like there is, I mean, of course, in places where there's like an active, pipeline or coal plant or whatever, there's kind of more of a natural, like, oh, we need to address this. But in places where it's new and people aren't even necessarily thinking along those lines and don't see it, as you say, as a priority, then it's about really helping to weave those connections and find those intersectional models of doing the work. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So a couple more policy focused questions, and I don't know if you had a chance to see my note or not. So, I have this speed round, like 5 quick questions, quick or not so quick, and so let's just see what happens. So this is focused on policy, really, So what policy has been the biggest barrier to achieving environmental justice? Like, is there one that stands out as just like, this policy has just been the worst?
Certainly, Citizens United is bad, just in terms of, for folks who don't know, but it basically gives corporations like personhood.
Yeah.
And so that's super bad. And in some ways, it's kind of not so much bad policy, but lack of good policy. That's more the problem than anything else. But yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great, because it's not an obvious one. Here I'm thinking like environmental policy. No. It's actually like a social policy and a finance policy. And yeah. So on the flip side of that, like, what is a policy that has really made a huge difference or really had an impact that's been, what we're hoping for?
The Clean Air Act, definitely. The Clean Water Act those have been starts, and they've made a difference for sure as we have advanced more progressive rulemaking under them. NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, has definitely been significant, but each of these just need, like, A, to be stronger, and B, to have much better monitoring and enforcement and consequences. But they're all at least kind of at their core or foundation important and have been instrumental in making certain changes.
And if you could design, and implement a truly transformative policy, what might that look like? Like, what would you go to as your, this is the dream policy?
So yeah, again, there would be so many, but certainly one would be campaign finance reform, getting money out of politics so we have a true democracy would be huge, because that would just make a difference in everything, right? So that would definitely be core. Another, interestingly enough, would be having a universal basic income. And that's important as we try to advance a just transition, and we find, that folks their livelihoods are going to be impacted for sure. And we want to make sure that people that there is a cushion in place for us all. And then also it's going to help with, climate resilience, because as we have these shocks to our society, we need to have, kind of a level playing field in terms of everyone having some basics to be able to get from day to day. Those are kind of big, pervasive ones. But then there's just such a bigger suite of policies that we need to be wrapped.
Sure. Okay, thanks. Yeah. A couple of like sort of current event related questions. Like around the Black Lives Matters movement, it's gathered so much momentum and it's become powerful in a wonderful way, unfortunately. And I'm wondering about that and the Black Lives Matters movement impacting environmental and climate justice. Like, is there an intersection there that you have seen even over the past 6 months?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is there's a platform. The Movement for Black Lives has a climate platform now, so that's awesome. And it includes all the kind of bigger suite of policies that, you know, everything from food justice to energy justice to water rights and all those different things. The other thing is in the there's a formation that's coming together around what's being called a red, black, and green New Deal. Because the colors of the kind of freedom flag, liberation flag are red, black, and green, and then we have, you know, the traditional Green New Deal. And so the red, black, and green New Deal is a singular policy or a suite of policies that really kind of are a comprehensive agenda that integrates everything from, you know, from criminal justice reform to and, you know, greater stronger regulations around environmental toxins and that kind of thing. So, and everything in between, food justice, water justice.
A next level New Deal.
Exactly.
Yeah, nice. Well, I have lots of other questions, and I'm gonna just table them for the next time we can get together, and instead shift over to taking a few questions from people in the audience, as I'm sure that will be very rich. So I think that Rachel has kind of queued up and kept track of who would like to ask you questions. So I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to Rachel.
Yeah, so we have a lot of questions, probably more than we have time for. I'm hoping I can shoot some of those to you after the presentation. But first up is Jeremy Ginsburg. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Jeremy, and go for it.
Hi, I've been working with an agricultural nonprofit that focuses on underserved populations, helping them conduct a survey of other organizations' diversity, equity, and inclusion policies and practices to help create their own. It seems that forming DEI practices are being conducted by a large amount of nonprofits and companies in general, sometimes actually doing it and sometimes just doing it lip service. What else could these organizations do that are often, and with these organizations that are often times run by cisgendered white men, but they actually have a desire to change, but don't have any experience with these issues?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So one, there is now a group, because as you say, this is happening so much, there's a Green Equity Officers Group, which is basically the DEI professionals that each of these organizations have hired so that they can come together and support each other through the storms of trying to reform these organizations. Even with the best of intentions, it can be quite something. And then B, to be able to just kind of trade best practices and, you know, really kind of build synergistic, promising practices around doing this work. So I would definitely suggest that if they're hiring someone, to make sure that they become a part of that group, and B, that they should hire someone, you know, who has that expertise to do the work. And then C, that they should really start at least with starting to do some like anti-oppression training within the organization to get people to get sensitized, so that even if once they get the resources to bring someone on board, they're not coming into like just like a wasteland of, you know, but they're coming into like some degree of understanding to get started. So those are some thoughts that I would definitely share, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Sure.
And Corbin, you're up next.
Cool. Hi. So this question that I have is actually passed on from Saeed Tijan Thomas Jr. with the new podcast called Resistance that dropped yesterday. It's really great. I highly recommend it to everybody. But he's following the Black Lives Matter movement and really documenting the surge of young people like crying out for change because they've had enough. And he had two questions. And I wanted to ask you, because of your environmental justice lens and all the many hats you wear, is this movement different? And how are people going to sustain it to affect change that we need?
So is the movement for Black Lives different? Is that what you said?
Right, from all the other protests where people like him, he said he's 27 now, he remembers being in the streets at 22, out here with everybody, and then just getting tired and worn down, and here we are again.
Yeah, I think that, I think it is different in that now it actually has a few years on it, you know, in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, and then it's evolved into the movement for Black Lives. So even that evolution, like the fact that it's sustained and that it has evolved into this bigger movement, I think is something in and of itself. Then secondly, the fact that it doesn't have kind of this kind of single iconic leader, which can always be like, it could go, it's a more kind of shared movement. I think that's definitely a factor of longevity, or you know, better sustainability, I guess. And I think thirdly that that there is kind of a new, I've been talking about how there's been, like, people are always kind of fighting for just like a little bit more than what's going on now. Like in terms of like even the civil rights movement hasn't been particularly, I mean, in the past you could call it revolutionary, but like in between it's kind of just trying to get to equal rights under a unjust system. Like, so I can have at least as much rights as you are, which is still aren't enough for us all. And so the more kind of transformational vision of the movement for Black Lives, I think gives a level of aspiration and energy to it that would that helps it to be sustained, because people are really moving towards not just surviving or getting by, but actually thriving and having a larger just a larger goal and mission. And I think finally, really, because we've in some ways hit rock bottom, like, you know, how whether it's people being in recovery or otherwise, I think that is kind of that's definitely a motivating factor. Just you know, with COVID, with again the peak that we've hit in terms of the level of injustice and pervasive understanding of it, has a motivating factor that has more than like the various flare-ups that we've seen in the past. Like, you know, back with Freddie Gray in 2015 and all of the stuff that happened there that just didn't really kind of go on from there. I think at this point, it has reached a point where people are more deeply committed, more organized, and more recognizing that we can't go on like this. So I'm hopeful. At first, actually, at the very beginning, I thought this is just going to be another flash in the pan and we're going to go back to business as usual. I was concerned, but I'm a little bit more hopeful as this organizing is happening now in a more, in a stronger way. So hopefully that was a long rambling answer to your question. Hopefully you're able.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks so much. Sure. Hopefully sustainability is the way.
Yeah, indeed.
And I show that we have maybe 3 minutes, maybe 5-ish minutes. We have time for one last question. Madeline, you are our final question.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Jackie. I just want to say thank you first and foremost for your time. It's been really insightful and inspiring listening to you talk about all these intersectionalities of climate justice and everything like that, and how it's pervasive throughout our entire experience here. So I want to say thank you for your time and speaking. I admittedly am not an international environmental policy student. I am the student council president here at MIS. And, you know, I'm looking right here on the explanation of this event, and it says that one of the NAACP environmental and climate justice program priorities are advanced energy efficiency and clean energy. And we have an issue going on here at MIS right now where they're trying to implement natural gas versus electrification for a building that is being paid for with our tax dollars. And I'm curious if you'd be open to looking at a petition that we've prepared to the Vice President of Finance over in Middlebury, Vermont, and potentially sign it if you feel in alignment with its mission. So I wanted to propose that to you in all due respect.
Yeah, no. So because we are always kind of with the HEMAS principles and all of that, it would, the endorsing of it, I'm happy to look at it and get feedback on it. The endorsing of it would have to definitely be from our Vermont and ACP folks. And then they would then come to us and say, we're endorsing this. We would love if you all backed us up, because they would have, yeah. So if you were able to reach out to the Vermont folks, that would be great to start. And I'm also happy to give, like, you know, technical, you know, feedback on it. And definitely if the Vermont folks are willing to endorse and they want me to do anything to support that, then I'm happy to do that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll put the link in the chat, and then I'll do follow up about what the route you just said. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. That's a very worthy pursuit for sure. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
That's great. That's our final question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Jackie, and everyone who's tuned in. And let's keep the conversation going in whatever ways we can, both practically and professionally in everything that we do. Thank you so much for your time, Jackie, and let's keep in touch.
All right, thank you.
Thank
you all.
you.
Take good care. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.